Okay, so starting with our next task, this is elicited imitation. It was technically assigned in the original schedule for last week, but we will get through things as we get through them. This is what the last group quiz, the first group quiz, the second half is on. Some of you have turned it in, some of you have not. Again, I think you should keep up with the original schedule as much as possible, but this is since we're going asynchronous, there's some more flexibility in that. So if you have not already done the reading quiz associated with this, please do so as soon as possible. I suppose you will learn some things from watching this version of the video, so. Okay, so elicited imitation. Elicited imitation has a relationship with elicited production. Elicited imitation is a form of elicited production. Both are essentially prompting participants to produce language use of some kind. Potentially, it could be in any modality. I could give you, a picture and say, sign me a description of this, right? Or I could say, write me a description, or I could say, tell me one. So really, it could be any modality. The most common type of elicited production is what I just modeled, which would be a description of a picture, but there's a lot more different types, The interaction section of, I believe it's chapter 3, the tasks chapter of Mackey and Gass would give you some more examples of elicited production in there. Interaction in particular has a lot of elicited production. But it's sort of the idea is that I give you context, you produce something, in whatever modality is appropriate to my study. As far as elicited imitation goes, it's a subtype. Specifically, you want them to repeat input in some way. To my knowledge, it's only been done orally, and sometimes as a proficiency measure. We'll kind of circle back to that thought at the end. But there's really no reason it couldn't be done elsewise. I think we like this idea of simultaneity. To some degree, there's some relationships drawn with things like working memory and executive control in the same sense as interpreting, this kind of simultaneous. Elicited imitation is almost supposed to be simultaneous sometimes. There's some relationships there of kind of like your language processing just kind of taking over and doing things that hopefully your brain isn't thinking all the way through. But this has to do with the assumptions. But first, let's discuss some types, because I think it will make the assumptions make more sense. The first type is a simple repetition, in which you would hear something like, what did you say that John bought? And you're supposed to repeat exactly, and so you're supposed to say something like, what did you say that John bought? But it's possible to subconsciously you change it to reflect your grammar. So let's imagine that, so the word that, which is bolded on this screen, is actually optional in most dialects of English. This is an embedded object extraction, or a long-distance object extraction, and the that is optional, typically. So I could say, what did you say that John bought, or what did you say John bought? Most people will take either one. And so perhaps when you're repeating simply, you will subconsciously change it to the other because you're thinking about meaning and your brain goes, yes, this works just fine, and substitutes in the other. Okay. So you need something that has optionality for this one to work. The second one is like a fix and repeat task. In some sense, this might be the more common one because you can kind of tell if they're fixing it, if their brain has any conscious knowledge of what's happening by the kind of correction that they do. So whereas you might hear, who did you say that bought the book? I hope that most of you didn't like that sentence. It's supposed to be bad, the question. There's some suggestion that there are dialects that allow it, but typically an overt that in the middle of a long-distance subject extraction is considered bad. Most dialects don't accept it. This is the famous that trace effect. So most people do not like, who did you say that bought the book? Most people don't like it. Not everyone. Some people are okay with it, and so if I've told you to repeat and fix stuff, most people will say, who did you say bought the book? As opposed to who did you say that bought the book? Okay. Now some assumptions, as I've suggested before, exist in this task. The elicited imitation task works that the idea that your implicit knowledge, your grammar, is going to play a role. The original people who worked on this weren't generativists, and so they don't have a very clean model of competence versus production necessarily, but they do have explicit and implicit knowledge. As UGers, we can also say that we're attempting to to have them do stuff that reflects their actual competence as opposed to their explicit knowledge of, let's say, rules or something like that. That is the idea behind this. Now remember, implicit knowledge is knowledge you're not consciously aware of, at least not in the moment that you're using it. And the idea that you're being prompted, and this is that you're supposed to be prompted to use language naturally without this conscious knowledge. Okay, and that ends up being a theme if we're going to propose how this works, why you would choose it, and its limitations, is about this conscious, subconscious, explicit, implicit dichotomy. So, two questions related to this. The first one is, how likely is it that when we repeat, we're not going to use our conscious knowledge? So if I say to you, what did you say that John bought? You know, is it likely that you're going to be like, oh, that. I'm not into the word that in the middle of that question. Right? It depends on the design. But, you know, there are two types, or two major types at least. And I think it's going to differ a little bit with the instructions. So this is a case where instructions and trainings and practice matter a lot. So my second question is, how do we increase the likelihood that we'll repeat without explicit knowledge? And does it differ by type of imitation task? Most of the time, well, there's two major approaches to this. The first one has to do with focus on meaning versus focus on form. So there's several types of strategies people use in order to draw your attention away from the form of the sentence. So even if you're supposed to be fixing it, if you're doing something else, you don't necessarily have the resources to think about it explicitly. Or if you're doing a simple repetition, you might think this isn't actually about the structure, it's about meaning. And so you don't really don't think about it. So if the most pure and implicit version of this would be a simple repetition with some kind of meaning-based distraction. And we'll see an example in a minute. The other way to kind of get away from pure explicit, sometimes people will cause you to wait in between. So you may not doing a meaning-based distraction, but you might hear a sentence and either have a period of time or something else filling that space that isn't related to the sentence. So this is just sort of an increase of time interval. And the idea is that we have a phonological loop, which is to say we have a memory of what we just heard. And if you get someone outside of that phonological loop, you're more likely to hear something that reflects their actual linguistic system. And this is kind of getting back around to the idea of a linguistic system, the idea that we have a built-up grammar in our minds. If you are a non-generativist, you'll talk about this in very non-technical terms like, oh, implicit knowledge of grammar. So either way, the idea is you're trying to find a way that you literally have to use your grammar, however you model that grammar in your framework. Again, so here are the two types that we discussed. I'm showing them again, so you're remembering them by type: a simple repetition and a repeat and fix. Now, simple repetition. To get participants to not use explicit information in simple repetition, most experiments distract the participant with a meaning-based kind of sub-piece of the task. For example, I think our actual article discussed having participants, whether the statement was true or false before they repeated it. So if I had a simple repetition with optional that wasn't a question. So I think that all trees are tall, for example. That is also optional, right? I can say, I think that all trees are tall. I think all trees are tall. And so if I then go true, false, and you go false, some trees are quite small. You go, okay, repeat it now. I think all trees are tall. Then I would, that distraction is meaning-based and also kind of gets you outside of your phonological loop. And if you just noticed, I didn't use the that in that repetition. So that is one of the tacks that they use. So my example from before, did you say that John bought? Does it work for that example? Is that true or false? No. It's not true or false. Questions don't have a truth value. So then the question is, what else could you use to distract them? I mean, the simplest thing is have them answer the question. Give them a context, pictures, whatever, and you say, well, did you say that John bought? And they go, a book. Okay, now repeat. And then you can see how that meaning-based distraction is kind of getting you outside of the repeat, repeat, don't think about it, repeat, repeat, right? Because if people are repeating without, that either that fast in the phonological loop, they're going to repeat verbatim regardless of what their actual grammar does. Or if they're doing it with enough time to have explicit knowledge or enough mental resources, it's two different problems that both can arise, right? Either they do it too fast and it's phonological loop and it's verbatim, and you have no idea what their brain actually thinks, or they have too much time for explicit knowledge and you're just measuring the wrong thing. Now, second type was repeat and fix. To some degree, explicit knowledge is unavoidable in a repeat and fix, right? You're saying, this is wrong, what makes it sound better? If you're lucky, they don't totally analyze it. No guarantees, but that's what you're shooting for in a repeat and fix task. So if a participant is asked to repeat and fix, we've decided that we really can't do it with a simple repetition, because simple repetition is the least explicit. So we've introduced an element of explicitness. It has to be worth it, essentially. So we probably, if we choose to do that, we're either not sure if they know what's wrong, right? So and this is one of those cases where it gets used for a proficiency measure. I say, fix all these sentences, and you don't actually know what's wrong with them because your proficiency is really low. You'll definitely see that when you repeat and fix the wrong thing. The second piece of it is we don't really know how they're going to fix it. So let's imagine that there's an error and there's multiple ways to fix it. One, as you remember, we talked briefly about in 317 about variability, and sometimes native speakers, given two options, have a likelihood to pick one over the other, even though both are technically possible. The participant might pick the one that's native-like, or they might pick the one that's technically possible but less likely. An example of two things that are both possible with native speakers, but one's much more likely, is the verb think or believe. Let's use believe. The verb believe with an embedded clause can either technically take a finite or a non-finite clause. So I can say both, I believe that John is intelligent. I believe John to be intelligent. Both of those are technically acceptable in English, but we're much, much, much more likely to say the first one. We much prefer, I believe that John is intelligent, over, I believe John to be intelligent. And if you're having doubts that I believe John to be intelligent is good, compared to, I believe John to run a mile. I believe John to be intelligent. I believe John to run a mile. To be intelligent is definitely better. Okay, so the point is that sometimes we have two options. So if I were to do a repeat and fix task, and the piece to fix had something to do with this embedded clause, the participant could fix it like an English native speaker, I believe that John is intelligent, or they could fix it the other way, I believe John to be intelligent, which, though is technically correct, isn't particularly native-like because we don't do it very much. It's a very high register way to go about that. So to summarize what we just saw, there are two types of Elicited imitation, simple repetition and repeat and fix. And you can minimize use of explicit knowledge using either meaning-based distractions like true or false and answering the questions, or you can try to create a time gap so they literally can't use their phonological loop. There is a hypothetical third approach, however, and maybe you've already kind of guessed at this. You could tell participants there could be errors. If there's an error, fix it, right? You can do it that way too. And I have two questions related to this, and I want you to kind of chew on and ponder. How much explicit knowledge do we expect with this third approach? If I say there could be one, is that more than a fix and repeat task, or is that less? I mean, it's kind of like a judgment task smushed in the middle in some sense. So I think, again, it's going to depend a lot on what your instructions are and your training and what else you're distracting with. But then the second question I have is, what are the potential benefits to this version? The potential benefits are you do get this sort of competence measure kind of smushed in there. You have the ability to tell, can they tell it's bad? And do they fix it? So it's a little bit production, it's a little bit competence, maybe. You have to make that argument. But I think there is a way to look at it as there's a piece of competence in there because they're making a binary judgment first and then producing it. And, that's a lot to expect of someone. But it gives them the possibility to kind of go, yeah, that's fine. Okay. All right. So briefly, reading quiz 8 had two questions on it. The first one I think we've talked about a lot. Define implicit language knowledge and discuss how it relates to imitation. It's fundamental, plus some more stuff. And Akakura's elicited production task, who showed up towards the end of the article, uh, the question was, how does it differ from Earlham, and why does Akakura call it production rather than imitation? Here you have kind of a quote out of the article. It's a little fuzzy, but I will read it to you as well. So to answer this question, here's a relevant question. Test takers had to listen to and tell a story rather than repeat a series of sentences that were semantically unrelated. So one big piece of the difference between the original elicited imitation and Akakura's elicited production, because that phrase actually exists, but this is Akakura's version of it, is that Akakura had them do a whole story. So it's inherently meaning based because it's across a set of sentences. The meaning is sort of continual. So the first part of the answer to that quiz question would be, yeah, well, Akakura's task was the whole story. So they're focused on meaning. It was pretty much hard to get away from meaning at that point. This chunk here, I would say, is what I would use to base the second part of the finish answering question to. So you'll see here the second half of the first full line. It says, test takers were informed that pictures always told the correct story because they saw pictures and heard a story. But sometimes the audio recording did not. Okay, so here, this is the sometimes. This is like the third type I told you about where it's, you know, a little bit repeat, but fix it if it's wrong. Okay. So, they would hear a bell sound, the story was narrated, this bell would be followed by a sentence. After listening to this sentence, test takers were required to indicate a separate sheet whether the sentence was true, false, or they weren't sure, so they're doing meaning-based. And after they made their choice, they had to repeat the sentence using the keywords that were written on, this is quite a lot. So using keywords to describe a picture, that's very much elicited production, but it has a piece of imitation in it, and their meaning distracting. There's a lot going on in this task. I wonder if it was very hard for them to actually do it, frankly. Sometimes there's a lot going on. I really hope that the training and practice on this were extensive because there's a lot going on. So, let's see. After they made their choice of true, false, or not sure, they had to repeat it, making sure using the key words, and then they might have to change a sentence from what they heard so they would match the picture. And it's not necessarily that it's wrong in terms of grammar, it's wrong in terms of content. So so in that sense, again, it has this piece of, it could be wrong, but from a meaning point of view. It's a little opaque from the way this is described in the text, whether sometimes the grammar was also wrong. But the point is, this is very heavily, heavily, heavily meaning-based. And the production piece does have prompts, right? It has little descriptions. So it differs from a typical picture description task in that there's a sentence that they're judging and repeating, but they still have a picture, they still have key terms, they still have a whole context. So in that way, it really is a melding of a traditional elicited production task with an elicited imitation task. I'm not convinced it's the best way to go about this, but again, I would have to see the training and how clean the results were. Anyway, so that is elicited imitation and production, or at least a tiny bit about elicited production. If you haven't turned in the quiz, as I said, please do so ASAP. And